Know me? Thanks. Thank you for joining us for today's JINSA webinar. We are honored to have joining us our friends Ambassador Ilan Suleimanov from Azerbaijan and noted foreign policy expert Svante Cornell. This interview will be moderated by JINSA President and CEO, Dr. Michael Makovsky. Ambassador Suleimanov was appointed Azerbaijan's ambassador to the U.S. in 2011. Prior to that, he was the first consul general to Los Angeles and the Western states. Dr. Svante Cornell is a JINSA Gemunder Center policy advisor and Eastern Mediterranean Policy Project member. Ambassador Suleimanov, Dr. Cornell, and Dr. Makovsky will be discussing the fighting between Azerbaijan and Armenia. During the webinar, you may submit questions through the Q&A box on the screen. That will be the way you can ask questions today. For those in the audience, you are automatically muted and your video is off. I would like to invite Dr. Makovsky to start this discussion.
Okay. All right, thank you, Harris, and thank you, everybody, for joining us. This is the fighting that's been going on there between Armenia and Azerbaijan. I think to most Americans, it's, and including myself, it seems rather complicated, and it's not something that is in the news very often, but yet it's very important, not just because of the the main countries that are involved, and where they're located, but with which countries these countries are also aligned with. And it's a complicated picture, and we're going to delve into this and hopefully illuminate a little more what exactly is going on and why does it matter to the United States. So I really appreciate both having the ambassador and Svante on to help explain this. And I'm going to turn to the ambassador first for the first couple of questions. And I think it would be useful, Ambassador, it's nice to see you. Thank you very much for joining us. I wonder if you could just start with something kind of simple. Well, not simple, but if you could offer a little historical context of Nagorno-Karabakh and the tension between Armenia and Azerbaijan within a very limited time. I don't mean to be like the US presidential or vice presidential debates. I'm going to give you more than 2 minutes, and Svante is welcome to interrupt you, although I doubt he will. If you could just explain for a few minutes some history here, historical context. What are the two countries fighting over? And then we'll get to today.
Good afternoon, Dr. Makovsky. It's great to be back with the JINSA family. It's a great pleasure, and it's always good to be with you. And I'm very happy to be with a distinguished and somewhat a little bit too well-informed expert, Mr. Cornell. So I have to be careful what I say. And I also, of course, want to thank everybody who wants to join today, because I know you're busy. I know it's a time of the presidential campaign, so and people finding time. That's a great honor. I won't take much of your time. In fact, I would not go too far in history. We could, but I think this is really not about historical discussion. It is what's happening now, and unfortunately, the fighting rages on in Azerbaijan. It's all on Azerbaijani territories, which is important to understand. So for the last 30 years, Armenia and Azerbaijan have been engaged unfortunately, in a conflict, which was the largest confrontation in Europe in early 1990s after the Bosnian War. Or Bosnian War and the Balkan Wars have overshadowed what happened between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but it was a very intense fight. As a result of that fighting, Armenia occupies today about 20%, or probably less today, of the Azerbaijan's internationally recognized territory. I want to emphasize that. That's not the territory Azerbaijanis want. It's not the territory that Azerbaijanis feel it's theirs. It's an internationally recognized territory, which is recognized by UN, every other nation in the world, perhaps but Armenia, although Armenia is very confused about what it recognizes, it doesn't, because we could discuss that as well. So about 20% is occupied, ethnically cleansed. So about 800,000 people became IDPs, internally displaced people. So imagine the size of Nagorno-Karabakh by itself is about 7% of Azerbaijani territory. Double that is occupied and ethnically cleansed in addition to this. So about 20 altogether. Plus, about so many people were ethnically cleansed. From the Aris Armenians never really claimed historically. I mean, and if you look to the fighting videos, you would say it's an empty land. It's a desert. There's nothing there. Only military installations. And that adds, by the way, a military dimension for that. Why? Because when Armenians bomb Azerbaijani side of the line of contact, there's a densely populated area. When Azerbaijan responds against the military targets, they're basically military targets. There are no people living along the line of contact, which is very important to understand. So the negotiation process, which was based on the 4 UN Security Council resolutions, 4 UN Security Council resolutions, and adopted in 1993 and 1994, call for immediate, unconditional withdrawal of Armenian troops and restoration of Azerbaijan's territorial integrity. Those are UN Security Council resolutions for which the United States, France, Russia, and China, all members of the Security Council voted for. They have never been implemented. But there was a Minsk group, which is OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, main mediating body. It's co-chaired by Russia, France, and the United States. In fact, there's an interesting caveat here. Up until 1997, it was only 2 co-chairs, a permanent co-chair, Russia, and a rotating co-chair, which was Finland, Sweden, Italy. When in 1997, OSCE decided to make France a co-chair, Azerbaijan thought that it would be too much tilted towards Armenia. So Azerbaijan insisted on the United States becoming a 3rd co-chair. So imagine that at the time, Azerbaijan felt, despite all the legislative actions of the United States against Azerbaijan, that it would still be a more fair co-chair. And since then, it's a tripartite group. So approximately since 2009, from 2009, there was what is called Madrid Principles as a main basis for the consultations between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And Madrid Principles are the basic negotiation plan based on and endorsed by Russia, France, and the United States, by the presidents, as a matter of fact, which includes ideas like withdrawal of Armenian troops from the areas outside Nagorno-Karabakh, the return of the displaced populations, security guarantees for both Armenian and Azerbaijani population of Nagorno-Karabakh living next to each other, resumption of normal links and economic ties between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and between Nagorno-Karabakh and the rest of Azerbaijan, the mainland Azerbaijan. And at some point down the road, well, first interim status for Nagorno-Karabakh area, and then sometime down the road, what they call a binding expression of will. So basically, what it is, it's an outline for peace. I don't personally like it very much. I don't fully agree with this, but it was the only thing on the table. So Azerbaijan accepted it as a basis for negotiation. We thought the Armenians did too, but then and that was what was negotiated up until 2018, when the new prime minister of Armenia came to power. He initially appeared much more open to negotiations. He's never been a warlord in Nagorno-Karabakh. By the way, the 2 previous presidents, Kocharan and Sarkisyan, were actually warlords who personally told British journalists that they participated in atrocities killing Azerbaijanis. So here's a gentleman who's never been a warlord. He comes from Armenia proper. We thought, look, maybe there's a chance to talk. And he appeared very open in the beginning. He asked the president of Azerbaijan to give him some time to figure out his domestic affairs. And Azerbaijan, of course, said, of course, why not? Then he suddenly said things which were completely contrary to the peace agreement. He de facto rejected all the Madrid Principles. And since then, the government of Armenia began rejecting every peace agreement which was there. Basically deconstructing the accumulated talks. One of the things which also happened, the defense minister of Armenia openly said, we reject the formula land for peace, and we instead accept the formula new war, new territory. We still thought that was a rhetoric, although in my own letters, in my own articles since last year in April and all this, I was always saying, look, rejection of Madrid Principles is a very dangerous development. It will lead to war because it's a major instability component. In fact, as late as on September 24th, President Aliyev spoke at UN saying, look, Armenia is preparing for war. Unfortunately, no one heeded the warning. So what happens on July 12th, this year, in summer, in the middle of pandemic, and I have to say that everybody was consumed by the pandemic situation because, the health of your citizens is number 1 priority. Armenia suddenly attacks across the international border. Now, this is 150 kilometers north of the occupied areas and north of the line of contact. We don't fight them. This is a small triangle between Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. That's where all the pipelines go. This is where the Southern Gas Corridor, which is at that time was supposed to be operational in 3 months. Now it's going to be operational in 1 month, and that's a very important part of the European energy security. That's where the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan passes, which provides about 40% of Israel's oil. That's where the air corridor goes for NATO overflights to Afghanistan. And that's where Armenia attacks. Now, one of the particular parts of it is that in this region, as a matter of the mentioned, the escalation effort of Azerbaijan, we removed the main military forces and replaced them by border guards, which is a lighter force. I mean, they're not that heavily armed. And that's where the Armenians attack. They attack there across the border, which is very unusual. And then one general killed, 14 more people killed, including the civilians. The shelling of civilian targets happened. And well, first of all, it's of course an attack on a globally important energy infrastructure, critical important energy infrastructure. But also, our understanding was that one of the goals Armenians had at this point is to involve a retaliation onto Armenian territory, because this way, because Armenia, is a part of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is a collective organization including Russia, it's led by Russia. And they immediately asked for Russian support, for the CSTO support. As a matter of fact, the CSTO did not respond at that. Armenia hosts Russian military bases. It has border guards, which guard Turkish and Iranian border, who are Russians. So they were hoping to expand the conflict. It didn't happen. So the new territories didn't happen. But now the Azerbaijani forces went to the full. Now the Azerbaijani forces went into the full. They went into the full alert, because we now knew that they could attack there. I mean, this became a significant problem, and our forces have sustained significant attacks during August. They were shelling and all this, and they were much more intense than usual ceasefire violations. So as a result, on the 27th of September, there was a massive attack by artillery fire against civilian subjects in Azerbaijan. We had people killed, people wounded. And this time, Azerbaijani military, being on high alert, responded. And there was now a counteroffensive by Azerbaijani forces against the occupation forces of Armenia. We have to understand once again, all that is happening on the territory of Azerbaijan. President Aliyev repeatedly stated, we have no military objectives in Armenia. We do not want to involve Armenia. We don't want to go an inch beyond our internationally recognized territory. So this is not a disputed territory. This is a territory of the Republic of Azerbaijan, where Azerbaijani military is fighting its war for defending its own nation. Now, that's also an important factor, because Armenia still tries to either to propaganda false narratives, or to actual direct missile strikes from Armenian territory to induce a response. Because they do hope that if they induce the response from Azerbaijani side, a retaliation against Armenia proper, then of course that would imply once again treaty obligations by Russia or someone else. We do not have any plans to retaliate against Armenia. We don't want to go into a fight with Armenia any farther than our own territory. So I hope I didn't talk for too long. This is where we are.
Okay. Well, we'll follow up. I think, by the way, as you saw while you were talking, we put up a map on the screen because we think it's important for everyone to see where that is. Maybe I'm going to turn to Svante, but maybe Ambassador, you could just explain one thing just on the map. I think we lost your, oh, there you go. So there's Nagorno-Karabakh here you see on the map, but then on the more southwestern part, there's another part of Azerbaijan. How does that logistically work to have that territory separated?
You mean Nakhchivan, right?
Yeah.
Well, Nakhchivan is, imagine, Nakhchivan is like Alaska, but for the United States, but it's a extraterritorial exclave. But imagine for a second that you have hostilities with Canada. God forbid. I hope you never do. But that is what the situation. It's a very difficult situation. In fact, Nakhchivan has for the longest time has been under blockade It's a very difficult. Thanks God, they have a border with Turkey. There was a 11-kilometer border. That you could see that there was a very tiny border, and that's a lifeline from Nakhchivan for Nakhchivan. And of course, that's a significant problem. You could only fly to Nakhchivan or take a bus to Iran, but mostly that's a serious problem.
But but your government only is interested right now. You're saying they don't seek to take back control of Nagorno-Karabakh, and they have no interest, or they have no uh, whether now or later, to try to have more of a contiguous territory, that all of the parts of Azerbaijan are contiguous. They accept even that Armenia controls that area before Nakhchivan and Nagorno-Karabakh.
Well, if you look at the map, Nagorno-Karabakh itself and it's that gray area, which is
Yeah.
called Lachin, and those are all parts of Azerbaijan, internationally recognized, but under occupation. Of course, we want to recover all those lands because they're Azerbaijani territory. However, the area which you see between the territories of Azerbaijan, mainland Azerbaijan, and Nakhchivan, which is our exclave, this is a part of Armenia legally, and we respect the territorial integrity of all states. We have no intention of attacking the territory of the Republic of Armenia. We have no plans to do that. And President Ali very clearly said, our intentions, whatever we do, are only limited to the internationally recognized borders of the Republic of Azerbaijan.
Okay. I'm going to turn to Svante, and maybe Svante could add some additional color. And I appreciated that a lesson that, for Americans, 30 years might actually does seem history. Of course, in that region, 30 years is more like yesterday. Svante, could you give a little color here about the different parties involved? You got Turkey, you got Russia, you got Iran, you got Israel, and then we'll talk about the United States in a minute. But you could talk about that. That would help. Thanks.
How long time do you have, Mike?
Yeah.
Well, we could talk about this for a long time, but I'll try to be brief. And thank you for having me on this call. This conflict obviously has been going on for a very long time. And I think what's important to understand is that this is a conflict that exists at several different levels. It started off as a conflict between the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh, which was an autonomous part of Azerbaijan in the Soviet period, and the disagreement they had with the Azerbaijani government in Baku. Almost immediately, Armenia got involved in the conflict, which made it an interstate conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, actually while these were still two Soviet republics. But especially after independence in 1992, it immediately escalated with Armenian forces intervening on the territory of Azerbaijan. And I think that's very well documented. What's interesting is that it didn't stay at that, but there's a third, what I call the geopolitical level of this conflict, because of what the ambassador alluded to with the strategic importance of the corridor between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, which became first the corridor for the transportation of energy resources from the Caspian to Europe. Secondly, it also later became the main corridor for the transportation between NATO territory and the military operation in Afghanistan, particularly the airspace between Georgia and Azerbaijan, and later on the ground transportation route across those countries as well. And now we're seeing between Europe and China the beginning of a land corridor for trade being built that also, where also Georgia and Azerbaijan play a key role. So all this meant, together with the fact that the South Caucasus as a whole was always Russia's buffer to the Middle East, if you will, that there were more interested parties, particularly Turkey, Iran, and Russia, that took an interest in this conflict, and where we see Russia and Iran both backing Armenia because of the general interest of these two parties in minimizing Western access to Central Asia and maintaining, if you will, a chokehold on the whole Eurasian region. Turkey, on the other hand, backing Azerbaijan. And what we've seen is over the years, there's been more or less coordination. In the 1990s, there was more coordination between Turkish and US policy. Obviously, in recent years, because of the poor state of US-Turkish relations, there has been no coordination on anything related to the Caucasus. But we see increasingly that while we have big disagreements with Turkey in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterraneans and in the bilateral relationship, we now see very, very rapidly how Turkey and Russia are coming at in confrontation with each other in a bunch of areas, and how Turkey is de facto acting alongside with Western interests, not only in the Caucasus, but also with regard to the Black Sea and with Ukraine, where they're supporting Ukraine and beginning to arm Ukraine, which we don't hear a lot about. So that's a different subject. It's a very complicated one that really confronts US policymakers with a difficult issue. But I would say that what really changed in the past couple of years, and why Ambassador Suleimanov is absolutely right, that this conflict was relatively stable until about 2009. That was obviously after the Georgia War, which really changed the calculus for everybody around here. And what we've really seen is, I think, and I outlined this in a recent article, three major changes. I'll just run through them very quickly. The first major change is that, when Russia started invading Georgia and then Ukraine, you see also Iran beginning to ignore international boundaries and creating, militias, supporting militias all the way from Lebanon to Yemen. Turkey intervening in civil wars in Syria, Libya. The Chinese, similarly, Saudis in Yemen. So bigger powers are no longer constrained by international norms and international laws and institutions. They're doing what they can get away with. And I think you heard this, Azerbaijan, has built their position, as you hear the ambassador saying, on international law. Well, if international law doesn't really matter anymore, then, you have to change your policies. And I think that's the approach that Azerbaijan has taken, that in this current international environment, it's very unlikely that, just talking about UN resolutions is going to get you very far. And after 30 years, then the question becomes, how long do you wait? And I think in Azerbaijan, like it or not, the leadership has decided that, we can't really wait anymore. The second part, I think, goes right to your question about the geopolitics, because what really has changed is how it's not just about Turkey's increasing involvement in this dispute, which is very obvious. But I think more broadly, what you have seen and which we kind of have missed in Washington is how the geopolitics of the South Caucasus, of this region, they didn't used to be connected with the Middle East. This was a purely post-Soviet geopolitics that was very much viewed within the European or East European security architecture. Well, what we've seen now is that the same powers, Russia, Turkey, and Iran, are the main powers that are involved in the Syrian civil war. Turkey and Russia are the main actors together with the UAE and Egypt in the Libyan civil war, and that the Russians were lobbying missiles from the Caspian Sea across the territory of the Caucasus into Syria. When Turkey shot down a Russian jet back in 2015, the Russians responded by sending helicopters to their bases in Armenia. So very rapidly, you see how the South Caucasus has basically been drawn into the Middle East, and the geopolitics of the Middle East and the Caucasus have merged. So as Turkey and Russia were, they were friends on and off again, and then enemies and adversaries. But as Turkey and Russia in the past year or two have really seen their relationship deteriorate, this has also affected the way Turkey views the Caucasus and the way Turkey views a need to defend their interests in the Caucasus vis-a-vis Russia. Finally, I think the major change locally has been what the ambassador alluded to, which is the change in Armenia's position. Armenia, of course, always wanted to keep Nagorno-Karabakh, but there was a tendency among previous governments to view the occupied territories surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh as basically a negotiating chip in order to exchange for peace and to exchange for a resolution to the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. What we've seen changing already in the late Sarkisian regime, but especially in the current government, is how the Armenian leadership began to view this as liberated territories rather than occupied territories in their rhetoric, reject any idea of land for peace, and basically change the very structure of the negotiations. And I think that was a decision that I always viewed as very dangerous, even from an Armenian point of view of the security and stability of Armenia. And I never understood quite the logic behind it, aside from being, reflecting a sense of isolation and pressure and a need to fight back. But I think we're now seeing that this decision by the Armenian leadership was one that was not particularly well advised.
All right, I'm going to come back to you, but let me go back to the ambassador. If you could I'd like to address two things, and then we'll go to questions. I understand from Harris that we already got a lot of those. But I'd like to, Mr. Ambassador, if you could address two things. I know this isn't a perfect map. It's not terribly detailed, but it kind of gives, I think, the audience some sense of where things are a bit. Can you just address a little more like what's going on the ground, about towns being Azerbaijan, I think, is captured or liberated, depending on how you decide to do some of these towns on the ground. If you could kind of give an idea of that, and also if you could address one issue that's come up in the press, whether Turkey is sending mercenaries from Syria into this conflict, which I believe Azerbaijan has said is not the case, but I'd like you to address that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Markowski. Of course, I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has from the audience. I'll be happy to do that. On the fighting on the ground, excuse me, is quite heavy. Azerbaijan has fully recovered the region of Jabrayil, which is far outside the areas of Nagorno-Karabakh. There's basically nobody there living now, and uh, we have to keep in mind that the people of Azerbaijani displaced population, many of them come from there. In fact, the areas recovered to date would allow about 100,000 people to go back to their homes. I mean, those are not settlers the way Armenians settle people from Lebanon and Syria. These are the people who were expelled, people who still hold deeds to their houses, soldiers who were expelled as children. They're coming home. So in some ways, we have to look at this also as an issue of restoration of justice, because these people have been living in exile. It's a very heavy fighting, but if you see what happens on the ground, you would see that, again, there's no infrastructure. This is only forward positions of the Armenian military. And this is the very disorganized, very Soviet style, basically designed to launch multiple launch rockets against civilian population. And by the way, as we talked about this, let's say these towns of Ganja, the second largest city in Azerbaijan, is being bombarded by Armenians. There's no military value to doing that. There is no military objective for Armenians to do that. They just try to kill civilians. They're doing that in Baghdad, and we have 31 people among the civilians documented killed, 50 plus injured. We have civilian infrastructure destroyed. You could see the main market, the main bazaar of Ganja was struck by a missile. Take a look at it. I mean, they attacked the Mingechever power station, which is the largest hydropower station in the region. Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, there was an attempt to bomb it. So they even fired as far as the vicinity of Baku. And that is actually it doesn't make any military sense. And if you think, why would they do that? And there is actually a very interesting example of this. During the invasion of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, at some point, with no military significance whatsoever, no useful military tactic, he fired a Scud missile into Israel. And you would say, why would he do that? And he wanted to gain a response from Israel, because an Israeli response against Iraq would produce a lot of solidarity for Saddam. It was a Soviet tactic, who taught him to do that. Armenians are doing the same thing. Pashinyan today is acting as desperately as Saddam Hussein. And by the way, his propaganda is very similar. If you listen to this, it's very similar. And going to propaganda. I went to school in Moscow. I studied in the Soviet Union. What you see today is a typical, basic Soviet propaganda 101. I know many of our journalists have not spent any time with that. They did not face it. But if you retrace back, you would see that all the stories about Syrian mercenaries and all, this is not only incorrect, they're actually this is a very clear part of the hybrid propaganda technique. I am actually very saddened by the negative impact COVID-19 pandemic had on the analytical and fact-checking capacity of the American media, because there's no fact-checking. So I'll give you an example. I know there was a question somebody asked: 3,000 mercenaries from Syria. There is none. There is not a single mercenary people could show on a battlefield. There are videos of Arabs saying something somewhere which looks like a desert. Yes, some people look like Arabs, and Syria looks like Azerbaijan. Yes, there is not a single proof of that allegation. In fact, I listened to some Guardian reporting, and Guardian, you know how it goes. how much Guardian likes Azerbaijan and Israel. So, for instance, one of the things they've done was they interviewed some Syrian fellow who said that his cousin spoke to the wife of his other cousin, excuse me, who said that he went to Azerbaijan and he died there, but they don't know if it's for sure. This kind of allegations are similar to the allegations that Americans committed 9/11 against themselves. And by the way, there was more videos with more evidence and more theories about this than that about what happens in Azerbaijan. I'll give you one more example. Well, actually, it's several examples. One of them, Elizabeth Surkov, which is now a big promoter of this idea online, puts a photo of Armenian soldiers with the Armenian writing saying Azerbaijani bring in mercenaries. But those are not only the Armenians, it's so simple just to check. The other thing, for instance, yesterday there was somebody published a photo of a bearded man next to Azerbaijani flag saying, here's a Syrian mercenary. I know that guy. It's an Azerbaijani guy. He had a beard. Okay, we look like Syrians. Dr. Markovsky, if you have a beard for 2 months, you probably also would look like a Syrian. This kind of a cheap, unsubstantiated propaganda has only one purpose. Photoshop, voiceover. First of all, it means that Armenians have long prepared that, and also that they have a training in this area, and we know where the training comes from. Yeah. Number two, they're trying to cover up for very simple things. Armenian terrorist organizations have fought and trained in Bekaa Valley. Armenia has military supporting Bashar al-Assad today in Syria. And that's why, by the way, one of the people who actually promotes the idea of so-called Syrian mercenaries is Bashar al-Assad. He fully supports Armenia. So with allies like that, what do you expect? And the other thing is that Armenians today bring in a reset of Lebanese radical groups. We have some information about PKK, which is, by the way, PKK, and it's not planned for the rest of the Kurdish population. PKK is a terrorist organization recognized by the United States. They're also brought into this idea. We also hear about other, and we need to get a definite proof, but there are some Lebanese radicals coming from the other side, the Shia militias and all this, who don't like us, who continuously come out against Azerbaijan. So Armenians are doing that and trying to cover up, and they're trying to get international sympathy by peddling completely false allegations without any proof. And for the media not to do fact checking. I think, Mr. Markovsky, for the future, I think we have to be very careful, because this type of a warfare, hybrid warfare, will actually become, I think this is a test. There are three things which are unique in this confrontation. One is the excessive use, intensive use of the precision weapons by Azerbaijan, including drones. Second is, for the first time, I think in history, if I'm not mistaken, an Armenian-owned battery of S-300 was actually destroyed by Azerbaijani state. I don't think it ever happened before. And the third, maybe the most important one, is that propaganda wars and misinformation becomes almost as important of a fight of fighting as anything else. And we have to be very careful. And my last point on this would be this. Dr. Markovsky, for a long time, my Israeli friends would try to convince me that much of what happens and much of the propaganda is actually fake. And I would tell them, how is that possible? How is it possible that you would stage a murder? Or how is it possible that you stage this? I mean, this looks so real. And now I understand that this is possible. And I myself did not understand that was so realistic. And now I see that this is the same method, and by the same outlets and the same people which use it against Israel now use it against Azerbaijan.
Yeah. Let me clear it. It's an interesting, thank you for all that. I wanted to bring it up, to Ambassador, because it keeps popping up in the press about these supposedly Islamic extremist mercenaries that Turkey has been sending there. So I appreciate your addressing. I guess, Svante, we're in a weird situation, and then after this, we'll go to questions, Harris. But I want to just kind of get a little more understanding. And then maybe I should have framed it up front. You got the Armenians and the Russians supporting Christian Armenia. You have the Russians supporting,
and the Iranians,
and you have Shia Iran supporting Christian Armenia. Azerbaijan
Yes.
is a Shia Muslim country. You have the Jewish state of Israel uh, with close ties to Azerbaijan, and reportedly Azerbaijan has been using some of their Israeli weapons apparently rather effectively. Um, and then you have the United States, and I'm not sure where we are here in all this. So if you could, and on that point, maybe you could address, like, what do you see is the U.S. interest? Because I got to say, you don't hear, I meant to ask the ambassador, we could still go back to him, but, you know, you explain a little more the U.S. interest here. Of course, you got the
Sure.
Turks on one side with the Israelis, and they two generally haven't been getting along lately. You have the Iranians and the Russians on the other side supporting the
Yeah.
Armenians, and they do cooperate about another things, but they disagree about others. Not sure where the U.S. is here in this dispute. I don't, and I'd like to see if you could address
Sure.
what you've seen there.
Thank you. Well, I think what's interesting about this, in a way, being able to look at it from a certain distance, is I would call it the endurance of national interests. And what I mean by this is that certain things have been remarkably stable. Obviously, some things are not. I mean, obviously, the relationships in the Middle East are all a mess. You know, Turkey and Russia have been going, like I said, for a while they were friends, then they were enemies, and they were friends again. Now, not so much. But something has been very stable around this conflict for the past 25 years, which is that there are really only three countries that from the start have unequivocally taken Azerbaijan's side in this conflict, and those are Turkey, Pakistan, and Israel. That's not necessarily, Turkey and Israel back then, you know, had some kind of an alignment. Pakistan was not quite part of it, and of course now things are very different. By the way, you talked about the Syrians. I was just reading in the Indian press today that apparently a whole lot of Pakistani military are involved fighting on the territory of Azerbaijan as well. Just like with the Syrians, I have yet to see any video evidence of Pakistani, soldiers in somewhere in Azerbaijan. So yes, we have this. But on the other hand, like you said, like you already mentioned, Russia and Iran have this enduring stance on this conflict, in which both of them have primarily been taking Armenia's side in order to stop the expansion of Western and Turkish influence in this region. Although I have to say that with the emergence of Azerbaijan as a mid-range power, with its own resources, military resources, financial resources, both Russia and Iran have seen a value in maintaining somewhat of a cordial relationship with Azerbaijan, which wasn't always the case. Now, going to the American interest, I think the interest really stems from two things. The main overarching one is geography. And that is the fact that if the United States has an interest in the heart of Eurasia, which some people think we don't, some people think we don't have an interest in Afghanistan. We don't have an interest in the territory that is encircled by all the major nuclear powers of the Eurasian continent, you know, Russia, China, India, Pakistan, and then Iran and Turkey. If you think this area doesn't matter, well, you haven't read the US National Security Strategy or the US National Defense Strategy, which all talk about the emergence of great power competition, or I think the exact term they use is strategic competition between great powers as the main challenge to the United States national interests. Who are these great powers? Where are these great powers? They're all surrounding Central Asia and the Caucasus. And Central Asia and the Caucasus is where you have small and mid-sized powers that are naturally predisposed to be American allies, precisely because they don't want to be dominated by any of these major Eurasian powers. And I would say that there are three major mid-sized powers in this region. That's Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan, which all try to reach out to the United States, and which all have their own resources that enable them to be real partners of America, and that are useful for American interests. They're not just, you know, recipients of American support, they're also providers of stability and security across this region. So I think that's what it really boils down to. And of course, there is a United States strategy for Central Asia that was just announced earlier this year. But the problem is that the US policy never really under this administration approached the Caucasus in a serious way. And it's so often, you know, you look at a map and Central Asia looks big and there are interesting things happening. Kazakhs and Uzbeks are reforming and are doing good things, but how do you get there? if you want, you can get there through Iran, or you can get there through China, or you can get there through Afghanistan. But if none of those options are really seem palatable to you, the way you access the Caucasus is through, I mean, you access Central Asia is through the Caucasus, this corridor between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And the only country that borders Russia and Iran is Azerbaijan. And I think at the end of the day, this is, you know, the simplest and most enduring explanation to why the United States has a strategic interest in this region. Now, the fact that Azerbaijan happens to be a secular Shia Muslim majority country, that shows, by the way, just like Bahrain is doing right now, also a Shia majority country that is making peace with Israel, is showing that just because you're a Shia majority country doesn't mean you have to be like Iran and be a theocratic regime that supports terrorism. I think that's an added value, but the real bottom line here is geography.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I have one last question. And I was thinking, by the way, of this Neville Chamberlain line when he referred to Czechoslovakia as a faraway country of which we know nothing, when in fact, Czechoslovakia was a very important country.
Right.
And I think that a little bit about Azerbaijan for Americans, it's actually a very important strategic country for the United States. On that last note, Mr. Ambassador, what would you like to see the United States do to help resolve this conflict? And what could they do?
Thank you. Dr. Markowski, the United States is a member of the Minsk Group, is a co-chair of the Minsk Group. It's also a member of the UN Security Council, permanent member of the UN Security Council. Both documents of the UN Security Council, international law, it's the highest body of international, and the OEC Minsk Group, they all demand the immediate withdrawal of Armenian troops from Azerbaijan. Now, I understand the emotions, I understand domestic pressures, political pressures. But if we want to see peace, and by the way, today, Foreign Minister of Azerbaijan is meeting with, let me tell you this, the Foreign Minister of Azerbaijan today meets with Minsk Group co-chairs, Russian, American, and French, in Geneva. Armenian Foreign Minister, as far as I know, is today in Moscow, so I don't know what is the next step. So Azerbaijan is committed to the format of the Minsk Group. We want to see a resolution. And what the United States can do, first of all, unlike France, the United States should stay an impartial and balanced negotiator. And that's why this is important. If we want to see a peace agreement, if we want to see Minsk Group succeed, the only way to do that is to maintain the trust of the both sides. I don't want the United States to be pro-Azerbaijan. That's not what we expect. We want them to be impartial. We want them to maintain the trust of the Armenian side and to maintain the trust of the Azerbaijani side. That's why all kinds of congressional resolutions and all this, while they might be alleviating the emotions of the Armenian Americans, or maybe good for some members who come from certain districts, they will not help. And in fact, they will probably undermine the US role as a fair negotiator. So in this respect, I understand the call for the immediate ceasefire. Trust me, we all want that, because today it's Azerbaijani civilians being indiscriminately bombed by Armenians, because Armenians don't have precision weapons. This is if you see the way they shoot, it's either 1940s military, Soviet military, or 1960s Middle Eastern terrorists. They use the same technique. They just shoot into the direction of civilians, hoping that there will be a response. I mean, I don't think that's unfamiliar to you, Mr. Makovsky. You're pretty much familiar with this tactic used against Israel as well. So what needs to happen? For 26 years, we had a ceasefire. It held more or less. I mean, it didn't hold for all time, but it did hold for a while. It did not produce lasting peace. It did not bring prosperity to Armenia. It did not bring prosperity to Azerbaijani refugees. It did not produce any development in the area. So what we need is not just ceasefire, but a clear understanding what will be the next steps for the solution of the conflict. And there's only one solution. There's international law. There's only one. I mean, however we dance around it, there's only one way to solve this, and that's a withdrawal of occupation Armenian forces from the Azerbaijani territory. And let me tell you why this is important, and US can insist on this. Armenia today is the last relic of the Soviet Union. It's not really an independent country. If you have foreign bases on your territory, if your borders are guarded by foreign troops, if you're completely indebted to outside budgetary influence, you're not an independent country. So they have beat a much greater chunk that they can swallow. Armenia cannot be an independent sovereign state as long as this occupation continues. And we don't want to fight against Armenians. we don't see Armenian people as enemies. We have thousands of Armenians living in mainland Azerbaijan outside the occupied areas. Azerbaijan is a home to very large Jewish community. It's the largest Jewish community in the Muslim world. We have very strong ties to Christians in Azerbaijan, to others, to Buddhists. I mean, it's a very diverse country, Shia, Sunni, all together. We don't have any hostility towards Armenians living in Nagorno-Karabakh. We see them as our citizens. Unfortunately, that area is now completely under full control of the military. That should end. And the United States should push not only for ceasefire, which Americans are rightly doing, but also to see in mind the more strategic view, how to bring peace, lasting peace to the region. And that's only possible by ending the occupation, by helping, or at least committing to the timetable of the occupation, and committing to promote independence and sustainability of Armenia. By the way, going back to something which we talked about, Dr. Markovsky, I see there are some comments. I could read some comments saying, look, U.S. intelligence confirmed that there are mercenaries in Azerbaijan. The media reports. Well, we talked about media reports. They all originate. There was actually a forensic study of that. I could send it to you if you want to. They all originate from ethnic Armenian, Syrian pro-Assad supporter who published something like this, who spoke to somebody, and they all doubled down. Nobody did the fact checking. So I'm telling you, these reports are not true. We could talk about this, but it's like just in Israel. You accuse somebody of something and then tell them, now defend yourself. Again, I lived in the Soviet Union. That's what the Soviets do. You learn this. Second, U.S. intelligence never confirmed anything like this. In fact, they speak quite to the contrary. I think soon you will see intelligence reports coming about some of the Shia radicals coming, by the way, which is kind of strange, against the Azerbaijanis, which are predominantly Shia. And Secretary Pompeo spoke recently. He said, "I have no information about this. I don't know what you're talking about." So I think that's important to keep in mind, not to fall for rumors, not to fall for misinformation. I think that's one of the greatest challenges, along with the loss of civilian lives, along with hostilities per se. This misinformation campaign poses a serious danger for the future against anybody. I mean, against anybody, and God forbid anybody to be on the receiving side of this kind of a response. By the way, something else I wanted to mention. Azerbaijani military, to the extent it's possible, does not target civilian targets. We have a strict order about this. I do not exclude, unfortunately, there might be some cases, but that's not the goal. In fact, we see it as our territories. We want people to live there, and we want the people to live next to each other, side by side. So it's not about hatred to Armenians. We don't want to target. We don't want to target civilian targets. We don't want to do this. Also, there's a lot of criticism about precision weapons Azerbaijan has. The whole point of precision weapons is to minimize collateral damage. Azerbaijani precision weapons today, be it drones or precision missiles, are specifically designed to take out military targets, not attack civilian population. I know it sounds bad because people say, look, they have drones, they have missiles, but think about this. Would it be better to do what the Armenians doing, indiscriminate fire against civilian targets, or it is better to have a very precise strike against the military target, trying to minimize casualties? I mean, just think about this. And Azerbaijan is not necessarily that different from the United States or Israel. If you are an American or Israeli, what would you prefer your military to have? And also something else. Somebody says, look, racist and other allegations. If just because Azerbaijan is a predominantly Muslim nation, well, we're a very secular state, does not by any means accusing Azerbaijan of being aligned with terrorists. By the way, most of the people which they call terrorists are actually Sunni radicals, while Azerbaijan is a predominantly Shia country, so there's a clear disconnect there. But to accuse that on the basis that we're a Muslim country, having that in mind all the time, and I mean it's always tried to bring a religious aspect to this, is actually is a pretty racist thing. If you look at the region, Azerbaijan is very clearly aligned with the Christian countries and with the state of Israel and with others, while Armenia is behaving in a totally different way. I'll give you one example. Ukraine and Georgia fully support Azerbaijan. In fact, Ukraine has been very vocal in supporting Azerbaijan. Why? Because they have problems with territorial integrity as well. Let's not get this into religious plane, because I would suggest those Armenians who listen to me today to follow the advice of the Catholicos of all Armenians, who spoke, I think, in Armenia today, as saying don't add a religious aspect to this conflict, because he understands Armenians have always lived in the Muslim lands in other places. There are Armenian terrorist groups cooperating with Middle Eastern terrorist groups. So I don't think that was done on a religious basis. So listen to Catholicos of all Armenians. This is not a religious conflict.
I understand from Harris, who texted me, that Mr. Ambassador, you actually covered a lot of the questions that have been asked. Some more politely asked than others, but we have time, I think, only for one question. Harris, you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is obviously the ambassador can answer it also, but this is directed towards Svante. Could Turkey and Russia reach some understanding among themselves on the current air-to-air fighting like they did in Syria? If so, what might that look like?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. I think that is hard to say because it depends on the general nature of Turkish-Russian relations, which, as I already indicated several times today, is very unpredictable and has been so for the past 5-6 years. The present trajectory is one where Turkey was hoping to have a fruitful relationship with Russia, partly because they disagreed so strongly with the US policy on the Kurds in Syria, and also somewhat strangely blamed the United States for involvement in the 2016 failed coup. What I think has happened is that Turkey has come to realize that Russia is not really a friend or an ally of the Turks. It doesn't mean they have yet understood that their best interests lie in restoring a relationship with the United States, but I think this provides an opportunity to convince at least some forces in the Turkish state that is the case. That's not exactly an answer to your question, but I think what really is true is that I would not be surprised if Russia has been somewhat surprised by the level of Turkish commitment to Azerbaijan in this conflict, which has changed the balance in this region, because for a while, because of the disengagement of the United States, which has been an unfortunate reality in this conflict, and the fact that Turkey was busy elsewhere, and for a while was actually reaching out to Armenia and trying to establish a rapprochement with Armenia through the protocols 9-10 years ago, left Azerbaijan fairly isolated for a while, and so to speak cemented Russia's dominance over this conflict and over the South Caucasus more generally. Because of Turkey's rekindling of interest, if you will, this is no longer the case, and that's changed the balance in the region. And we have to see what the Russians do. I think what's missing from today's discussion and what's missing from much of the reporting about the conflict is the Russian position. It's extremely important. And I think just because Russia is not acting very visibly, it doesn't mean that we should forget that Russia has an outsized impact on this conflict, and they may yet put their thumb on the scale, if you will. They may not find that to be in their interest right now, partly because they are not particularly fond of the government of Mr. Pashinyan in Armenia for totally unrelated reasons, and they might not mind that he gets a slap in the face. What will they extract from Azerbaijan for, so to speak, not interfering or allowing Azerbaijan to do this move? We have yet to see. But I think the fact that Turkey is involved changes that balance and makes it more unpredictable. Could Russia and Turkey come up with some form of an agreement? I think at this point, Mr. Ambassador, you stated your support for the Minsk Group. I have long been very critical of the Minsk Group. I think the Minsk Group is totally obsolete, frankly. What we've seen here is an enormous failure of Western diplomacy. The fact that you have a very predictable escalation of this conflict year by year by year, and the Minsk Group has proven totally unable to do anything about it. I think that suggests that something else might be needed. I don't know necessarily that either Armenia or Turkey would be well served by the idea of some kind of Russian-Turkish agreement on this conflict. That might not be what they want. That might, however, be something that is necessary to solve this conflict at some point, because without Russian and Turkish acceptance, I don't see really how this conflict can be resolved. I can't really tell you if I think that's very likely at this point. We could also see an escalation of tensions between these two countries. That's the trajectory we've been on. But I think both in Russia and in Turkey, there is a certain understanding that we shouldn't go too far in making enemies of each other, and that might actually be something that helps bring the two parties to the negotiating table. What I would say is that I think we see now a conflict, we see warfare. I'm not surprised by this, because for years I have said that this conflict is beginning to resemble the Indian-Pakistani conflict or the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is to say that you have for a while something that looks frozen, and then it erupts, either in a major eruption like we have right now, or a minor eruption like we had in 2016, which I kind of jokingly compared to the Kargil invasion that Pakistan did in 1998, for example. That's the way these things are going to continue if we don't move towards a final negotiated solution. Now, Turkey and Russia are essentially partial to this conflict. Russia is on the Armenian side, whatever they want to say, and Turkey is on the Azerbaijani side. So with United States direct involvement, which still is a power that both of these countries can somehow rely on as not being, excessively interested. Geostrategically, the U.S. has closer relations with Azerbaijan. At the same time, just look at Congress and you see the strong support for Armenia there. The U.S. still has the possibility to act as an honest broker, but for the past at least 10 years, the U.S. has really neglected this not only opportunity, but responsibility, which comes from being part of the negotiation process.
By the way, and I know we've really kind of reached our time, I'll just ask you real quickly, Svante, just to follow up. You mentioned at the beginning, in this segment, that maybe Turkey now realizes they and the Russians don't have as much. Of course, historically, they've often been on the opposite side. But there's a report this week that the Turks activated the S-400 for the first time, ground-air missile system. Is that accurate, by the way? And that was...
Well, Mike, I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to answer that question. There is so much misinformation and disinformation flying around on this conflict. I am personally trying to look into and understand these alleged Syrian fighters, because it makes absolutely no sense for Azerbaijan, with a large functioning military, to bring in a few hundred Syrian fighters that happen to be Sunni jihadis that would not be your natural allies as a Shia majority country. I see all the reports. I want to see evidence. There are so many reports about, we heard about the Turks shooting down an Armenian plane. Turned out not to be the case, as far as I can tell. So I think we have to be very careful about assessing any and all of this information.
The ambassador was very generous to the media earlier and said, well, it's tough to do fact checking because of COVID. I think for anyone who's been following at least the media, at least in the Middle East, for a long time, I'm not sure COVID has anything to do with the lack of proper fact checking.
That's right, Mike. Let me just say one thing about this. As far as I understand the situation with the S-400s, the Turks would not be able to activate them without Russian personnel being in place. And I don't see how the Russians would have sent that personnel under the current circumstances. So until proven otherwise, I would have a hard time believing it.
Look, I think we've gone past time. Mr. Ambassador, do you want to have the final word? And otherwise...
Yes, well, thank you, Dr. Markowski, once again. I think this is an important conversation. I just want to touch a little bit on the Russian and the Turkish role. As I said earlier, we have expressed our concern to the Russian side that over all of July and August, and actually in September, there were significant deliveries of Russian military cargo over the territory of Iran to Armenia. We still haven't got an explanation why this happened and what was the intention of it. The daily flights delivering military cargo. President Aliyev raised that with his Russian counterpart. We raised that with the Minister of Defense of Russia. Interestingly, Georgia closed its airspace for the Russian military deliveries to Armenia. So they had to fly over the Iranian territory. Or in fact, one of the most interesting things is when they bring shipments to Iran and they have to drive to Iran over land. Azerbaijani population, about 30 million people in Iran of Azerbaijani ethnic background. They're so upset about this that they've been protesting quite strongly. And there were even some tension in the north of Iran because they don't want to see that Iran, an Islamic republic which professes to support a Shia cause to become a transit and enabler of Armenia, which is now getting weapons through the Iranian territory to kill fellow Shia Muslims in Azerbaijan. That's actually a very interesting conundrum. On the top of that, I want to touch something about Turkey very quickly, which is very important. And Svante said that he's surprised by the commitment of the Turkish state. I
think we lost your connection there, Mr. Ambassador. Hello? Harris, it seems like
he's
now
back.
we got you. Sorry.
Yeah. So we should listen. We should have taken a warning issued by one of the most prominent Armenian thinkers, Gerald Libarida. What happened was that the leadership of Armenia, including the president of Armenia, at the 100th anniversary of the Sevres Treaty, which was a treaty which was denounced, expressed support for restoration of the Sevres Treaty. By any means of diplomatic affairs, that's a declaration of war, because that means partition of Turkey. When a head of state of a neighboring state basically lays a territorial claim and demands territory, de facto territories from a neighboring state such as Turkey, of course, that was a declaration of political warfare and diplomatic warfare against Turkey. And as a result, I think that was an additional factor, which, you know, I don't know if it's, I mean, how important it was, but I think we need to keep that in mind. On the last thing, on the propaganda warfare, I was reading the comments and answers. As a matter of fact, speaking of Soviet propaganda, as you see, there's people still refer to 3,000 mercenaries and all this. This is how it's, this is exact example of a fake news. I know that some of the users here who are kindly listening to me are Armenians who register under the fake Jewish names, just to create a misperception that Jews somehow upset about Azerbaijan. This is Soviet propaganda. Welcome, my friends. This is not new. Just read the comments. You see what people here not to ask the questions, but to push Armenian propaganda under Jewish names. So this is exactly what happens in the region. And then you know what they would say. The Jinsa supported the claim that there are 3,000 mystical mercenaries from Syria. So this is so predictable. This is so usual. And that's how fake propaganda, be it against Azerbaijan or be it against Israel, works. So you have a very clear textbook example of it right before your eyes. Please read it, and you could see how it works. So don't be surprised that somebody would pick it up and say this is the case. So I mean, obviously, you know, I try to answer the questions. People try to push their narrative despite everything under fake names, and that is exactly what happened, and that's how all these claims originate.
Well, whatever it's worth, the Jinsa, we believe that the United States have stronger strategic ties to Azerbaijan. We wish you and your country good fortune going forward, and hopefully a quick resolution of this particular fighting. I think Svante's point about where we go from here on the diplomatic side, I think will be interesting. That we'll have to take up on another call, but I think it's a very interesting point. I want to thank you and Mr. Ambassador and Svante for taking the time. I think of all our Zooms that we've had this year, this is the longest one we've had. It's obviously a really fascinating conversation. It's a very complicated situation. I hope those listening, I'm sorry we couldn't take more questions. Hope many listening found it informative. And I'll turn it over to Harris. And we look forward to having you in future Jinsa Zooms and calls. Harris?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, Svante. Thank you, Michael. And thanks everybody in the audience for participating. Please keep your eyes open for future Jinsa Zooms like this one. And we greatly appreciate your time. Have a great week, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, you too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.